And thank you for everybody in attendance today. I know this is one of those talks that I've been asked to give a lot. So one thing that I did is adjust the title just a little bit so that I can give you a flavor of the full range of activities that we have going on, in addition to just some additional detail on results that I have shared before with the center regarding a survey that we did earlier on in the pandemic. So I've adjusted the title. We're going to talk about all about assessing the impact of COVID-19 on Florida's agriculture and marine industries. And I'll back up and give you a little bit of extra information on our production agriculture, marine industries, and our center before we dive into results. So production agriculture in Florida, for anybody that's joining us that might not be familiar, we're literally the A to Z of commodity production in the United States. So you might think of allocators to zucchinis or asparagus to zinnias. We produce about 200 to 300 different commodities according to estimates from different organizations. And some form of production agriculture is present in every county in the state. So that's all 67 counties of Florida. We've got 47,000 farms operating on 9.7 million acres, and we're producing over $10 billion worth of crop, livestock, forestry, and fishing products. And it directly supports nearly 138,000 full-time and part-time jobs throughout the state. If we switch over to marine industries, commercial fishers in Florida, they harvested over 80 million pounds of fish and shellfish in 2019. And that's in addition to a small amount of other marine products as well. We actually rank #1 in the harvest of at least 10 different species. And that total harvest is valued around $300 million per year. There's also more than 6,000 acres of land-based aquaculture in the state. This is operations that are growing marine wildlife and plants in ponds or in tanks that are inland, and as well as 1,600 acres of coastal zone area that's producing aquaculture products such as oysters and clams. We've also got a variety of other businesses that provide goods and services in support of commercial fishing or marine recreation activities. So you often hear that Florida is the recreational fishing capital of the world. We've got several different operations involved in seafood wholesale, as well as beaches and coastal areas that attract tourists from around the world. So this is, a wide variety of things, from diving to visiting the national estuaries that we have, as well as just coming to the beach. So to take a step back here, the economic impact analysis program is housed within the Food and Resource Economics department here at the University of Florida. We've got an expertise in areas of regional economic modeling, economic impact analysis, economic contribution studies, as well as disaster impact analysis. We provide technical assistance to industry groups, other academic units, including the Cooperative Extension System, government agencies, and local communities throughout the state of Florida. And we also conduct sponsored research projects that involve detailed analyses of particular industries, regions, or situations. And as Philip mentioned, my personal interest in connections between human and natural systems, we're moving in the direction of some larger interdisciplinary research projects to show how the economy is connected to everything that's going on in the environment as well. So you see there, we have a small administrative staff, as well as several postdoctoral associates and graduate research assistants. And we're happy to be able to bring in the funding to support this team. If I focus specifically on the work that we do related to disaster impact analysis, so this could be anything typically we focus on natural disasters. So a tropical cyclone, a wildfire, severe weather, a drought, flood, maybe even a freeze event. And since 1980, NOAA has collected information on what they term billion-dollar natural disasters. So these are events that resulted in at least $1 billion of total cost. The United States has experienced 285 of these billion-dollar natural disasters since 1980. That's statistics through the 2020 season. And they've resulted in a total cost across all events of $1.88 trillion. So Florida alone has experienced between 5 and $10 billion in economic losses annually resulting from these natural disasters. And what we discovered after Hurricane Irma came through was that there are not data and tools that are available to readily assess the agricultural losses from these natural disasters. Most of the what you might call state-of-the-art tools to estimate economic losses associated with disasters are focused on urban areas or electricity grid downtime, and even some modeling tools that have been put in place for man-made disasters such as terrorist attacks. Um, if we look at these billion-dollar weather and climate disasters over time, again, since the data started to be collected in 1980, you can see that it appears that these they are increasing in number and cost. One thing to keep in mind when we look at a graph such as this, though, is that this doesn't necessarily indicate that disasters are increasing in number or intensity, but we do have a little bit of additional monitoring as well as additional human stuff in the path of these disasters, or the value of that stuff is higher now than it was in 1980. So we need to be careful how we interpret this number, but they are increasing over time. If we look at the frequency mapping, so I'm presenting to a Southeastern group here. Between 1980 and 2020, you can see that the Southeast states appear on the higher end of every type of disaster that NOAA is monitoring here. So all the way from the tropical cyclones down to the winter storms or freeze events that you don't typically associate as much with the Southeast, but we had the seminar couldn't have better timing for watching what's going on with the ice storm that just passed through and the next one that's coming through. So we do get these events as well. So, we started to think a little bit more about the agricultural assets that are at risk when these events come through. So we've got standing annual and perennial crops, live animals, there's forest inventory, things like nursery and greenhouse structures, additional infrastructure, so irrigation systems or stormwater impoundments, the aquaculture facilities that we mentioned earlier, or just machinery and homes and office buildings. But in addition to production agriculture, there's things like packing houses or processing facilities that can be impacted by disasters, and research, extension, teaching facilities as well. So, what do we typically do in an event here in Florida is we provide a quick estimate of the either a credible range is what we put out initially, or a final estimate eventually of losses. So we've developed several tools here within the program to quickly assess and gather information with the help of cooperative extension faculty throughout the state on what has happened after a particular event. What we do is combine that information that's coming in with geospatial data on crop acreage. So we know where things are grown with relative accuracy here within the state of Florida, and we adjust for the season or the timing of the event. We then gather geospatial event data. So in this example for Tropical Storm Eta that I'm showing here on this slide, we have information from the National Hurricane Center as well as the National Weather Service on wind speeds and precipitation. And again, we have tools to quickly gather crop damage field estimates. And we combine these with damage estimates from past disaster events as well. So in this case, this was early information that was coming in from the extension agents and producers. And then finally, an estimate of value per acre for these affected crops. So similar to the timing of the disaster affecting what's in the ground, the timing also affects the price, and these prices are more variable than they are for other types of commodities potentially. So we take a 5-year average to adjust for any events that happened in the prior year, a particularly good or bad season in terms of yield or supply. And then when those value per acres are not available, then we look at information for a commodity group average or a value for a specific industry from economic databases that we house. So in this case of Tropical Storm Eta, we ended up with a rather large range of losses estimated it was 85 to 320 million. And if you see the visualizations on the right, that was due to the fact that we were experiencing a relatively mild storm in terms of wind speeds, but we had very heavy precipitation in some areas, and that precipitation was not occurring in the same regions that the higher wind speeds were occurring. So we had a little bit more wiggle room because we hadn't necessarily experienced this exact type of event before in the time that we've been collecting data on these events. But typically we've been doing this again for several years, like I said, since Hurricane Irma made landfall, and we were asked to assess COVID-19 once the pandemic started to induce shutdowns here in the state of Florida last spring. Um, but the transition to assessing COVID-19 was very different. So when I'm dealing with something like a tropical cyclone, I'm looking at things like oranges that fell off trees or flooded vegetable fields, or the wind has damaged the plastic that has gone down and delayed planting. But we had a very different situation with COVID-19. It wasn't an event that so much affected the production of these commodities, but the demand for these commodities. So food service industry demand, 50 in an average year, or at least in 2018, 54% of food money was spent on food away from home. So in places like restaurants, or when you're on a cruise ship, or when you're out eating food at school, or in potentially in an office cafeteria. And with COVID-19, the effect of social distancing, might call it physical distancing, and stay-at-home orders, or even the shutdown of several different businesses originally, demand for food in places like theme parks, restaurants, hotels, schools, etc., declined precipitously and almost overnight. A large portion of Florida's production actually goes into this hospitality and food service industry. So one example that we've heard come through the pandemic is that tomatoes alone, tomatoes produced here in Florida, roughly 80% of that crop goes into this hospitality and food service industry. So this event caused a major disruption to our food system. If we look at South Florida food production in particular, then this area supplies much of the fresh fruits and vegetables throughout the winter along the East Coast. So in several interviews and conversations with Jean McAvoy down in South Florida, well, I myself learned about the scale of production in Immokalee alone. So Immokalee, Florida produces 400 to 500 semi-trailer loads of vegetables each day from March to mid-May in their peak season. So this equates to 15 to 17.5 million pounds of vegetables every day. So often, and initially when things were shutting down and we were seeing on the newsreels about vegetables rotting in the field or being dumped, and at the same time hearing about people that had lost their jobs and were looking for food in places like food banks, the sheer volume of the sheer volume of food that was coming off of these fields, and or still needing to have labor to get it to the end of its season and harvest it, it was a complete mismatch between being able to get it to an individual and having normally been set up to go into this hospitality and food service sector. So what we did is shift our tool. I had help from several colleagues in the Food and Resource Economics Department, in particular Andrew Opicki and John Lai, to convert the tool that we typically use to assess natural disasters to assess COVID-19. And we collected responses in an initial wave of surveys from April 16th to March 15th. And I've showed these results before, but I think it's always good to go back over them, and I'll tell you about another survey that's going on at the end to sort of update these numbers. But we had very good overall participation, especially while these operations were trying to run their business during a pandemic. We had over 700 responses from production agriculture operations, 319 from the commercial fishing sector, and several responses from seafood wholesale dealers, the for hire or charter fishing industries, and then the marine recreation support that I mentioned at the beginning. And one of the things that we were able to do with these data is something very similar to what we do during a natural disaster, is to estimate that change in sales revenue. Um, but again, the story for COVID-19 was very different than the story for some of these past events that we've assessed, in that we had a very wide range of what was being reported. There were several operations that were reporting complete losses or 100% loss in their sales revenue during this time period that we were assessing, and others that actually ended up doing better, whether it was because people were looking for alternative sources of food when some of the grocery shelves were empty, or these businesses were able to pivot faster to a different to supply a different market. Some of them were reporting upwards of 90 or 98% increases in sales revenue at this period. But if you look at the orange bars, what those are telling us is that even though there was this wide range of responses, overall the average impact for every sector that we assessed was negative. So you see that goes from negative 20% in the animal products industries, all the way down to negative 57% in these commercial fishing industries. One other thing to keep in mind is that, again, I mentioned the variety of commodities that we grow at the beginning. Even with 700 responses to this survey, I don't have enough data to produce an estimate for the exact amount of loss for every one of those 200 to 300 commodities. But there were several that we were able to do this for in a few of the different commodity groups that I just showed. And this chart here is telling us that there were not only wide ranges between commodity groups and what was reported, or what the impact to sales revenue was, but even wide ranges within a commodity group for specific commodities. So the example that I like to point out here on this graph is within that livestock and aquaculture commodity group, we had enough data to assess what happened to both beef cattle and clams and oysters. And they experienced very different things across these two sectors. So we heard a lot about the beef processing plants and the beef supply chain, and what was happening with employee sicknesses within these facilities. They were shutting down. There weren't very many alternatives. And then in something like aquaculture, clams and oysters, an even higher percentage of that product goes into this restaurant sector. Most people when they consume seafood, they're consuming seafood away from home. And there's a little bit of hesitancy to cooking seafood at home. Florida Sea Grant's been doing a very good job of getting recipes and useful tips for cooking seafood at homes through a program called Seafood at Your Fingertips. But again, they experience very different things. And we can see here that none of the clam and oyster aquaculture operators reported an increase in sales. They all reported something between 10% and 100%. And on average, we're down 75%. But if we looked at beef cattle, some also were reporting that complete loss. Some were reporting an increase in sales. I know I myself found a few local beef producers that I enjoyed trying during the pandemic. And overall, they were down 36% in terms of sales revenue. What we're able to do with these numbers is to look at the estimated losses in sales revenues in terms of dollars. So we combine that information on the percentage loss from the survey with information on total annual sales revenues for these particular industries that we have in our economic databases. And also information on what is the average annual percentage of the revenue that they make in this March to mid-May period. So this doesn't mean that they experienced those losses over the entire year necessarily, at least not at the time that we were surveying them, but we wanted to say, what were they losing in that period they were able to report on. So we could estimate the level of output that was at risk, use those percentage losses from the survey to estimate total losses in terms of dollar values. And you see the sum total there across only the agricultural commodities was about $895 million of losses to production agriculture in Florida from March to mid-May directly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. If we switch over to looking at some of the information from commercial fishing, so you had seen the percentage losses there at the beginning, but we have different databases that we have to use in order to estimate these sales revenues. So we had the survey average monthly revenue impact along with information from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, Conservation Commission on monthly revenue values. Again, an average between several of the last years, 2015 to 2019, to estimate the sales revenue losses for commercial fishing. And the total that we got for that particular group was about between 24 and $28 million. We're continuing to work with those monthly landings data to improve these estimates since they are reported more often than the agricultural production information. For the rest of the marine surveys, just to provide an overview, several beyond commercial fishing, we had several other industries that we estimated. Some of them we have good information on the size of this industry economically, and some of them we do not. But we had good response rates, and in contrast to what we were seeing with the agricultural production, many components of the food system were deemed essential and open. So on the agricultural side, over 90% of the operations were open and operating in some capacity. But when we looked at the seafood wholesale dealers or the charter for hire operations, there was a much higher incidence of closure for these businesses. And a complete closure, at least for the time period when you're closed, was 100% loss in your sales revenue. For the charter for hire survey, it is one more example where we do have some data on the size of this particular industry. So we asked respondents across several different charter types. You can see there in the top table the number of observations by type and the average change in revenue. Every one of them was over 90%. Things were shut down, people were asked to stay at home, and they weren't going out on these charter for hire fishing trips. When we look at this information, along with some information that we have from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration through the Marine Recreational Information Program, we've got monthly angler effort estimates, and through the National Marine Fisheries Service, we also have some estimates of charter fees per angler trip. And we can estimate that these particular industries were losing between $40 and $43 million during the pandemic. In terms of seafood wholesale dealers and marine recreation support, these are industries, like I mentioned, that we don't have as much information on their size or their economic importance to the state, but we were able to interview them to see what was going on in terms of percentage changes across customer types or across main operation types in terms of the marine recreation support. And you can see that they were experiencing something in between in terms of average change in revenue, in between what we were seeing with production agriculture or these 98% losses that we were seeing for the for-hire charter sector. But I wanted to make sure that I covered ongoing efforts. So we are still continuing analysis of these March to mid-May survey data, and I'm getting a lot of requests for things like regional assessments or commodity-specific assessments. And we sort of got hit by a very active hurricane season while we were trying to assess these earlier. It got put months behind on some of these efforts when we tried to move over, do Hurricane Sally, Tropical Storm Ada, and we just have several things going on. And to be honest with you, there's only one of me. But we are still analyzing those data. We have identified some regions and even in very few cases, a particular county where these regional assessments are going to be possible because we did receive enough responses. In terms of commodity specific estimates, we were able to release a report specific to shellfish aquaculture that's available on the website. I can provide at the very end of the slideshow. But we're looking in the data to see if there's other commodity specific assessments that we can do. Again, we have to have enough responses for a particular commodity or for a particular area in order to be able to do this. So it's very, very difficult for us to do a commodity specific, region specific estimate with the amount of responses that we got the first time. In addition, we've been collecting what we call stories behind the data. So I'm a data person, but it became very clear in the pandemic that these numbers were not telling the whole story. They were not able to convey exactly what was going on and why it was going on across these different industries. So we have a collaborative effort with Florida Gulf Coast University, and Florida A&M University is just about to be um, online with their IRB approvals to join the group. And it's this effort to collect stories behind the data. It's been going on for some time. We have done one webinar on um, perceptions or what we were learning so far. And we're continuing to collect these interviews to have enough that we can perform qualitative data analysis on them and provide some information on, what did make a particular operation resilient throughout this, to provide information to others for future events. So I'll move on from this slide though, because the next several describe this, just to make sure that we caught this information on collecting the stories behind the data. There was a county extension director, David Outerbridge in Lee County, Florida, had started this conversations with different types of operations throughout the food supply chain in his area. And what we did is, speak to each other and expand his efforts to a wider network of extension and state associations. So what we're doing in this effort is documenting the stories and capturing qualitative data that we can combine with some of that quantitative data that I shared before. We're doing interviews via Zoom to, initially we weren't allowed to visit these operations and interview people personally, but we can get broader engagement throughout the state by doing them this way. It allows for easier transcription for that qualitative data analysis. And what we're attempting to do is just document these interactions to preserve the data. We're asking things about what was your experience during COVID-19. So initially we had several operations that said, you don't want to hear from me. I did better during the pandemic, or I'm doing fine, so I have nothing to share. But those operations do absolutely have information to share, because there's a reason that they're doing okay during the pandemic, when an operation of the same type, maybe in a different place or supplying a different market, is not. So we're asking about adaptations in terms of new partnerships, business shifts, decision-making, shifts in the market that you're supplying, as well as things like innovation. So technological innovations. Did you start selling online all of a sudden in the pandemic, or change your marketing strategies, or change interactions between with consumers or with other businesses in your realm? Regulations. So we're asking a lot about, were there regulations that inhibited you in the changes that you wanted to make? So you might have wanted to be flexible and make a shift, but there was a regulation that stopped you from doing that. Also regulations that might have enabled or policy decisions that enabled change or enabled you to keep going, or even just regulations that enlightened everyone's knowledge about either the pandemic or the experiences during the pandemic. And finally, risk perception. So we wanted to ask a lot about whether operations thought they were prepared for something like this, or if they were not prepared, what might they have done differently in order to be prepared. The other project that we did receive the USDA funding for, and again, this is a multi-institutional effort, and we're a part of a much larger project. It has 4 objectives. So the first is to assess the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on farm and food supply chain operations. So very similar to the survey that I just discussed, that we implemented here in Florida early on in the pandemic. We have expanded that survey to look across other geographies outside of the state of Florida, particularly in the areas of the Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then Southern California and the state of Florida. But we are collecting information from other regions if they would like to provide it for our national analysis. We also expanded beyond production agriculture. So we're looking at everything from production agriculture all the way down the food supply chain to retail and wholesale distribution. And we want to understand capacities and structural vulnerabilities of regional food systems to support their population needs, develop resources and strategies for current and future disruptions, and then finally, um, offer training programs to strengthen support and understanding for local and regional supply chain participants, especially during times of disruptions. So I mentioned the supply chain survey. We are asking farm and food supply chain businesses in these study regions, how was your food and farming businesses been affected by the pandemic or by public health measures implemented or just the economic crisis that has resulted? Did you find business innovations to improve the resilience of food supply chains? And really, when we get to the end, tell us anything and everything else that you would like to about the experience. So we're hoping to collect enough responses that we can examine differences in impacts across sectors and commodities, um, also across regions and business scale and scope. And if I cut out prior to on the slide of ongoing efforts, one of the things that we are still doing here with our initial data set collected in Florida is trying to dig through and see where do we have enough responses that we can provide regional level assessment or a commodity specific assessment. I mentioned we have been able to complete one specific to shellfish aquaculture. And we would like to do the same for other commodities or other regions if the data allow us to. So you will see a media blast coming soon in Florida. The other regions have started collecting information already. We're stuck in the IRB approval process, but I'm expecting to have that approval in my hands today and set the media blast out as early as tomorrow. But we're asking anyone in the food supply chain to help us spread the word and help respond to the survey if you are willing and able to share that information. It is completely anonymous. So I'll just spend a very few minutes on, what have we and others learned so far? So, we collect all these data, but, are we learning anything or can we say anything about, how generally we've been impacted? So in terms of mitigating the impacts of COVID-19, it seems like there's 4 things that were sort of key. Um, Supply chain risk management. So if an operation did have a plan or a risk management strategy, if something like this were to happen, then they were able to implement that readily. Business continuity strategies. So I know that a lot of us here at the university were shifted to remote work almost overnight, and we're able to do so. So when there were business continuity strategies in place, that a shift like that was more effective quickly. Diversified supply chains. So we hear a lot about supply chain disruptions that happened when you were able to shift to another market or another supplier with your product. The blow of the pandemic was softened a little bit, but if you were not, you only had a single supplier or you only had a single market that you served, it was a little bit harder to do that or to adjust on the fly. Finally, multi-sourced key commodities. So it gets back to that single supplier component. So what seems to have worked, and again, these are my generalizations from the perceptions of what we've been able to do with the interviews and the quantitative data, and they're not necessarily statistically assessed at this point, but our perception is that strong relationships with key suppliers have helped. Agile production and distribution to maintain supply and broader supply chain planning. What seems to have limited effective response, a single geography for a market or for supply, it was a little bit harder to adjust if the demand in that single geography plummeted. Single supplier for key products. If you only work with one supplier and that supplier closed down or was unable to meet an increase in demand, then it was much harder to find another alternate supplier during a pandemic. Um, Lacking the visibility required to see risks. So I interpret this a little bit as, lacking the visibility that that a business had of how they themselves fit within the broader supply chain, but also some, in another context, lacking the visibility to other components of the supply chain of your own place in it. But we have done a lot of education on how exactly the food supply chain works. And I think that that has helped both businesses and individuals. Improper inventory systems. So when it was hard to know when you should stock things or not stock things, when a pandemic completely shifted to the demand, that made that process even harder. And then just operations that have been too rigid. So they were not flexible or were not able to be flexible, whether that was by choice or again, potentially through regulation, then it was harder to cope with the pandemic. So, if we start to think now about moving beyond the pandemic, what we can do, it's really revealed to us that the US food supply chain needs adjustments, or it needs improvements and innovations in order to be truly resilient and adaptable in the face of something like this happening again. I would say embracing flexibility over rigidity, transparency, maybe instead of holding back proprietary data or not wanting to respond to the surveys that inform these national databases or state databases of what's out there when we need to assess it. And then just education. I mentioned education for the general public about the food system, but education for businesses in order to make them more flexible or more resilient in the future based on anything that we learn in these projects. Just finally, in terms of policy implications, I'm often asked, what is it that we're hoping to do with all of these efforts? Effective policy for any of these sectors is going to require crop or commodity specific damage and loss data. So this is true for any of the disasters that we talk about. So the natural disasters and something like the pandemic. If we want to have national strategies for disaster risk reduction that do truly support resilience and sustainable agricultural and marine development, they've got to be informed by the particular nature of the disaster's impact on these sectors. So addressing hazards that cause the greatest losses, designing measures that are specific to the crop, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture, and even forestry subsectors, and then adopting more systemic strategies that counteract the impact of disasters on sector growth and development and on national food security. That's all I've got, Philip. We can open it up for questions, and I'll leave it here on this slide, just ways to engage. So I've got my personal contact information there on the right, as well as several different websites that you can visit for some of the information that I presented today, as well as just signing up to get more information about the USDA project, or even who to contact if anyone listening today is interested in being interviewed about your experiences with COVID-19 or knows others that might.
Yeah, that's wonderful. No, this is really helpful information. And hopefully for those of you participating, you can, while these links aren't clickable, you'll be able to write them out if you want to explore some of these. So at this time, first off, I just want to thank Dr. Court for that great presentation. And now we do have some time, almost 15 minutes or so, for some questions, some comments, just, maybe sharing some personal experiences, or just some questions, finding out a little bit more about, the research and some of what Dr. Court has shared. So use the chat box for that. I'll give everyone just a few moments to type in those things, and then we can cover some questions if there are any. So once again, go ahead and use the chat box to type in any questions or post any comments. Oh, there are a couple questions that just came in. So are there any written summaries that we can share? Krista, I'll let you answer that question first.
Sure, I can kind of answer both of those at the same time that just came in. So
Sure.
one, I don't know if I cut out when I was trying to say it earlier on the ongoing efforts. One thing that it has been my fault is that we have not finalized the written summaries of some of these things because we got completely sidetracked by hurricanes once hurricane season started and was very active this year. So we are finalizing several different written summaries of these, and they'll be available as soon as they go through the graphic design phase on that disaster impact analysis website that I shared. So anybody that's interested in having those sooner rather than later is welcome to email me, and I will create a list of the so that I can notify you as soon as I put them up there and share a PDF as soon as they're ready. And as well as the slides, typically what we do is put a copy of the slides on that website as well, that disaster impact analysis page. But again, if you would like to email me, I can share those, and I share them in PDF form. But if you're interested in using them for an extension audience within the state or anything like that, just let me know and we can make sure that you get the information and the graphics.